This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Today I have a two-part episode, what I'm affectionately calling the libertarian episode. First, Alex Tabarrok, co-author of the Marginal Revolution website, along with Tyler Cohen, who has appeared on my show. Alex is an economist at my alma mater, George Mason University, and he was not selected because he happens to be at my alma mater. It just so happens that my alma mater has taken the lead on libertarian free market principles. Second on the show today, David Nott, president of the Reason Foundation, which is all about the advancement of free minds and free markets. I first came to know about David and the Reason Foundation because a couple traders in my world, Bill Dunn, Richard Dennis, and some people that have appeared on my podcast, Walter Williams, Vernon Smith, are on the board of trustees at the Reason Foundation. So ask yourself, why are all these really bright people, a couple of them, two of the great traders of the last 30 and 40 years, why are they there? A great conversation with Alex, a great conversation with David. I hope you enjoy both. So listen, here's where I'd like to go today. I figure while I have you on and you've got this nice perspective, what I would like to do is describe the global playing field. The world is flat, so to speak. And then what I want to discuss is innovation. And I thought a great place to start with in terms of the world is flat is something I've seen you say about China, the world's greatest anti-poverty program. And what I think is really interesting, I was back in the States, I'm in Asia right now, but I was back in the States in July, and I don't have kids, but everyone that I see, I'd be like, what are your kids going to take? What language are they going to take? And invariably in Northern Virginia, it's Spanish. And I would just look at them and I'd say, listen, it's about a 12 to 14 hour nonstop flight from Washington Dulles to Beijing. Have you been reading a paper? What are you doing? Listen, your kids can talk to the without Spanish. And I'm not ripping on Spanish. I'm just saying the economic boom is in China.
Yep.
So why don't you, before we even get into innovation, let's pick a couple countries, perhaps the US, perhaps China, perhaps India, but start with China. And maybe, I don't know how you feel about me being so dogmatic about, I don't have kids now, but being so dogmatic about, listen, just get your kids taking Mandarin.
Sure.
Am I crazy?
No, I don't think you're crazy at all. China is, whatever happens in the next few years, and I think, China is going to slow down. China has been growing at 10%, 9% per year for practically the last 30 years. As you said, the greatest anti-poverty program in the history of the world. It's completely changed not only the face of China, but the face of the rest of the world as well. And that's going to slow down. Nevertheless, just by looking at the numbers, China and India are going to be the center of the world's economic activity. You have over 1 billion people in China, about 1 billion people in India. So just by the numbers alone, that's going to be the center of economic activity. And that's the norm, actually. If you go back, 500 years, 1,000 years, and you look, where's the world civilization? Well, you see the Great Wall, you see the Taj Mahal. You don't see anything going on in North America, at all. The history of the world's most innovative places, the history of the world's biggest GDP, that is in India and in China. And that's going to return to be the case. That's going to be the new norm, which is going to be the old norm.
Well, why don't we talk about that? I love some of politics aside, I do love some of Tom Friedman's analysis in the Lexus and the Olive Tree and the world is flat, the earth is flat. Why don't you talk about, though, to my audience and maybe get them really understanding, look, a lot of people still, my family, friends, Northern Virginia, you still hear China. It still feels distant. Yeah, you read the newspapers, but you're on the ground there, and you take a bullet train covering 1,000 kilometers, and you see 30-story condos built every step of the way. I mean, it shakes you. It's not something that we have in the States.
Yeah, I mean, now to some extent, of course, they are building new things, which always look naturally more modern. And we shouldn't regret the fact that we built, our skyscrapers many years ago. That's just because we're already ahead. Hopefully we will someday get our bullet trains as well if we get our infrastructure act in order. Nevertheless, I do think you're right. And I actually think that's pretty good for us, because it says we cannot any longer assume that we are the top dog. The United States has, since the end of World War II, has been easily the leading country. And, why compete? We're already number one, right? So, with China in our rearview mirror, don't look back. It's bigger than it appears. That is going to be a competitive stimulus to us. It says, we'd better get our act in order. Why is it that China can build a 10-story building in 30 days, and for us to do the same, takes years? How is it that they can build a entirely new subway system in Shanghai, build it over 2 years, and we can't even start to get the permits completed in 2 years? The state of our infrastructure is bad and deteriorating. And one reason for that is precisely that it's so expensive to build here, to get through the environmental regulations, to get through the legal regulations. Someone is going to sue you. The federal government has got their rules. The state government has got their rules. Local government. Oh, sorry, that building is historic, that outhouse. You don't want to take that down. President Lincoln, wants stopped here. And it just becomes impossible to build things in the United States.
You raised some great points, and I think this can be our entry into innovation, which is the idea of regulation. And many of the things that you've touched on, I've seen firsthand in my life. But why don't you talk even more specifically about regulation and that stranglehold? Because we have created this bureaucratic monster. And look, the American people, we know how to go kick butt if we're not tied down. And I think somewhere along the line, it's almost like a lobster in a cold pot of water brought to boil. It's like we've reached this point where everyone realizes there's this massive regulatory bottleneck, but no one knows what to do. No one can really stop it. And it just keeps getting worse.
Absolutely. I think the lobster is a good example. The analogy, which I like, which goes to Mike Mandela, and I know Tyler Cowen has used it before, but it's like throwing pebbles in a stream. You throw one pebble and nothing seems to happen. There's no problem. You throw another one and that's okay too. But you keep throwing these regulations, each one of which on its own is not so bad, and each one of which has some good reasons. Well, you could say, well, we need this. It's not a bad idea. Let's do this. But they start to interact and they build on one another until finally you're in a thicket, to change metaphors, or you've dammed up the stream. You've dammed up the stream of innovation, one pebble at a time, one regulation at a time. This goes back to one of my favorite books is by Mansur Olson, The Rise and Decline of Nations. Olson died early, but he probably would have won a Nobel Prize had he not died. And one of his insights was that when you have a stable country, which is a good thing, but when you have a stable country, over time, these interest groups build up, they accumulate. It's like cholesterol in the veins, right? It builds up on the veins until you get a heart attack. It's just over time, you get more and more regulations, you get more and more special interest groups, and that just makes things so much harder. You have to ask permission to innovate, right? When you have all of these interest groups and all the laws and regulations, then anything that you do, anywhere you try and walk, you suddenly find, no, there's something preventing me from going in that direction. There's a lawsuit, there's a law, there's a regulation, whatever. And it kills a country over time. One of the things which Olson, terribly or ironically says, one of the things which helped Europe after World War II and also helped Japan is that we removed all the interest groups. One of the benefits of the war was getting rid of the old guard. This was true in Germany, of course, but it was also true in Japan. You got rid of the Kuriatsu, the old guard, and that really bumped growth rates up for a time. I hope we don't have another war in the U.S. We don't want that, but maybe the picture of China catching up on us will do the same thing.
Yeah, you mentioned interest groups. I was in Singapore a few weeks ago on business. I can look at Singapore and you just instantly know they got rid of the interest groups there too.
Right.
I mean, somebody, the prime minister, somebody said, okay, we're going to turn our little small island into this economic powerhouse, but they had to put interest groups aside to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's rare, but if you actually do have a benevolent dictator or at least a benevolent, powerful leader, they can actually do some good things. Unfortunately, it's usually not benevolent, but when you get one, yeah, it can do some good things.
That's a great point, though. The benevolent dictator, for all of the things that we hear in the States about some areas, like, for example, some communist governments in Asia, I mean, look, there's no perfection in government, whether it's in the States or various countries in Asia or Europe. But that benevolency, you really have to sit back at some point in time and say, gosh, they kind of have done that so far in some places. They haven't done it in North Korea, it doesn't appear, but in a lot of other places they have.
Yeah, so the empirical literature on democracy and dictatorship is kind of interesting. Having a dictatorship doesn't necessarily give you slow growth rates, but what it does do is it gives you very variable rates. So you have a North Korea, you're really, really low. You get a China, a Deng Xiaoping, you're really, really high. So if you're willing to take some risk, then democracy sort of gets you more in the middle. But a dictatorship, can get you on the ends. I do worry, however, that one of the responses, I think we're seeing this in Europe, we're also seeing it in the United States, that one of the responses to this demisclerosis, to this buildup of interest groups, is to call for more power in the center. You see the growth of the presidency, the power of the presidency in the United States. And I think in Europe, we're seeing calls for, more iron hand. And I do think that's a danger. For all my joking aside, I think democracy has a lot of benefits, not just for political liberties, but we're also going to need a democracy in an information age. So one of the things which I think is worrying about China in the long run, as well as, some other countries, is that without the free expression of information, without the ability to transfer information, to move around, to talk, to discuss, that's going to hold their economy back. Yeah. It has both political and economic aspects to it, this information transmission.
It's a great point. I can flat out say that in some hotels in China, you can get your Facebook and Twitter, but by and large, most of the Chinese were surprised that I could even get that you just can't get that in China. But across, for example, just Asia, in my experience in the last year and a half, it's pretty wide open. The only other place that I saw that had some restrictions was Thailand. Thailand, you occasionally would get the screen of death saying you're not allowed to be there because there could be something bad on that page. But yeah, China is winning the game, so to speak, on restrictions in terms of the online world.
Yeah, it's frustrating trying to blog from China. Got to circumvent all of these things, but they're trying to do it for political reasons. But when somebody is trying to find a bargain on the internet, this kind of thing is affecting them too. If you can't reach out to your friends, then you can't reach out to your scientific colleagues either. It makes it harder to get a new paper, makes it harder to read online and so forth. So I think with our modern age, information age, that these restrictions are going to harm as well.
But they might come back and say, "Hey, hold on, look at Jack Ma."
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I said, yeah. So they've had some successes. That is true.
Hey, so listen, as we talk, there's a couple issues I want to jump into on innovation. I thought one of the first places we could start would be education, something near and dear to you. And I would love to get you to comment on K through 12, and then we can get into college. But just the idea of the current American educational system. And I went through it, not exactly recently, but enough to remember what it was like. And I was not a good student in any way, shape, or form. I think primarily because I was bored, and primarily because I thought the entire process, and look, growing up in Northern Virginia, I thought the entire process was designed to get me excited about taking a federal job for life so I could imagine what my retirement payments would be when I got to the age of 52, when you can retire in the federal government, whatever it is. But the point being that I'm bringing about this innovation is I know you're really keen on innovation, but it seems like to me that so much of education in America is still predicated on getting the end user, the kid, focused on working for the man versus what is innovation? What is the next Steve Jobs? It doesn't seem to come through our current system.
I do think it's a problem. One of the most scary things about this recession, and in fact, the trend even goes back farther than that, is that entrepreneurship is down in the United States. The number of new firms is down. This is actually a long-term trend. It's not something, I don't know what the exact causes are, but certainly when you're in school, becoming an entrepreneur, that's something which the weird kid does. That's not certainly something which is encouraged. And, I mean, the entrepreneurs are the troublemakers, right? The entrepreneurs are the ones who are sent to the principal's office.
Yes.
I may have an entrepreneur in my household, at least judging by the times the principal calls me.
What are some ways, you look at these issues, you think about these issues. We were just talking about regulation. I was going to ask you the follow-up. How do we get the inflection points so the trend goes the other way? I look at K through 12 and college education in America. How do we get the inflection points so it goes the other way? It seems like these bulls are out racing down the street, and the things that you and I are talking about that we I think everybody can observe needs to be going a different direction. How does that happen? What's the trigger point? What gets it started?
So we certainly need higher quality teachers in the classroom. Recent research shows that a better teacher one standard deviation, better than the average, raises the future earnings of his or her students by hundreds of thousands of dollars. So getting a better teacher in the classroom is a really high value proposition. And one of the unfortunate or side effects of the feminist revolution, right? Starting in the 1970s and 1980s in the United States, was that smart women used to become teachers. That was a career which, you had your summers off, the hours were pretty good, and you weren't going to go as a smart woman into business. You weren't going to go into law. You weren't going to go to become a physician. And again, this is, 50s and 60s. You became a teacher. Well, as those professions opened up to women, the smart women have left teaching. And in fact, you can see the, incoming SAT scores of teachers, and they've gone down. So, and salaries, of course, of teachers relative to other people of, similar intelligence and so forth have gone down. So I think that there's actually room here for a bargain, if you like, between the left and the right, or however you want to put it, in that, yes, let's have higher pay for teachers, but we want more accountability. We want more flexibility. We want the ability to fire teachers. We want the ability to test teachers. And if the teachers aren't working out they go. We need to get the best ones in. The American teaching system is the most Soviet-style system, one of the few we have remaining in the United States. We pay a math teacher about the same as we pay a phys ed teacher.
Well, that's perfect. That's perfectly reasonable. Come on.
So what that means, of course, we have great phys ed teachers, but not so many great math teachers because they've got better opportunities. So I'm all for increasing the salaries of teachers, making this a real high pay profession, but it's got to be a high pay, high stakes profession.
Yeah. Let me get you to go into a slightly different area on innovation. I think these things we're talking about all lead towards innovation. I would love you to talk about intellectual property and specifically patents. And it's not something I've really talked about on my podcast before. I've gone through the trademark process before, and it's I mean, it's a nightmare. It's fees that never end. It's paperwork that never ends. I don't necessarily know if it's either good or bad. It's just, I sometimes feel like it's a game for the attorneys. But I would love for you to talk about patents in particular and innovation and how you see patents in the American system for the good and for the bad as of right now.
I think we've gone overboard on patents. There's just been the idea, and I blame us, the economists. I blame myself in the sense that we told everyone, property rights are important and incentives are important. And of course, that's absolutely true. But you can go overboard, especially when it comes to something like intellectual property. You do want some incentives to create intellectual property, but a lot of innovation is cumulative. That is, you take one idea and you build upon it. So what this means is, if you have a patent and you want to build on that patent, or you want to modify it, make it better, improve the process, well, now you've got to pay for the patent. So when you are building, when you have cumulative innovation, having these strong IP rights raises your costs. It raises costs of further innovation. So I think we've gone too far. I mean, most famously, the software patents are out of control. Amazon's one-click patent. Mm-hmm. And it's crazy that we give 20 years for this. I would like to see a sort of a more flexible system. How about giving like a 2-year patent, a 10-year patent, and a 20-year patent, depending upon, your cost of investment, something like that.
As we talk about this, I once again, I start to think about back to, to education, to regulation. The horse is running down the street. It's left the barn. I mean, where's the inflection point for these great ideas, these nice, calm, rational, reasonable ways that you're looking at our country, our economy? When does any of this happen? When does the trend change, or does it keep accelerating the other direction?
So I do think there are some causes for optimism. Just on IP, for example, the interesting thing about IP is that much of it is judge created. It's judge created law rather than coming down through legislation. And the judges are pretty smart. And I think they're actually beginning to see some of the problems with IP. In the last, 5 or 6 cases, the Supreme Court has been pushing back. So I think the trend there, I think we have seen the bend of the curve has started. We have some room to go. On education, I also think there's some room for optimism, in large part because the United States is so decentralized. We have the states and local and so forth, and you do see a lot more experimentation. I mentioned earlier about Mansur-Olson and these build-up accumulation of interest groups over time, and how sometimes you need a disaster to get rid of the interest groups. Well, we've seen exactly that in New Orleans. New Orleans had Katrina. It literally wiped a lot of the city away, but it also had the side effect of wiping away the school system and all of the entrenched interest groups which were running that school system, which was one of the worst in the entire country. And New Orleans now has the strongest charter system, including vouchers and part of it, in the entire United States. So it's turned something which was completely ossified and made it a very vibrant educational system in New Orleans. So I think there are some grounds for optimism, and that's just in the United States. And there's also, I think, some more grounds for optimism in the world.
George Mason University, how did this become maybe you would disagree with this characterization, the libertarian economist hotspot? It seems like every time I want to talk to somebody, you guys all ended up at the school that I went to. How did this happen?
Yeah, it's interesting. What really happened is that well into the 80s and 90s, really smart free market professors, both in economics and also in law, were kind of discriminated against. Jim Buchanan and Ronald Coase were both at University of Virginia in the 1960s, and essentially they were kicked out. Their colleagues could not get tenure. They weren't respected. They didn't get funding, and they were scattered to the winds. Both Jim Buchanan and Ronald Coase ended up winning Nobel Prizes. And that kind of attitude against free market professors, that continued. So when we hired Jim Buchanan in the 80s, he'd been at Virginia Tech, good university, but it's not Yale, it's not Harvard. It's not even Berkeley, right? So you had this future Nobel Prize winner who was at a really modest university, and George Mason was a modest university. So we were able to play the Moneyball technique and hire somebody like Jim Buchanan. Same thing with Vernon Smith. Vernon Smith again won the Nobel, but he was kind of discriminated against. Experimental economics, which is what he got the Nobel Prize for, was considered kind of kooky, kind of out there for a long time. And this is true generally. Free market people were not being given their just desserts. So you were able to, as I say, apply the Moneyball technique and bring these really great people to the economics department and also to the law school. The law school has just shot up in the rankings, and it's because you can get really smart conservative or libertarian people on the cheap. And that's the technique which has been applied.
I got to tell you something fun about Vernon. I've talked to him several times, and the first time I think was in 2007, and it was an in-person interview, and I was doing a documentary film, and in my mind, Vernon is famous because I asked him the very first question, and his answer went for 37 minutes. And I thought that, so I still always remember that for any interview I've ever had, that was the longest question. So it was awesome.
But wait, haven't you interviewed Richard Epstein?
No. Should I?
Well, Epstein might win on that. Be aware.
Okay, I'm making a note.
Yeah.
Listen, let me wind down with just something a little bit unrelated. I know you can go in so many different topics, just like when I talk with Tyler. But Japan. I love Japan. I absolutely love Japan. I go there. I love the food. I love the people. I love the culture. There's nothing about it that maybe if I lived there, I wouldn't like it or something. I don't know. But I've got a lot of friends that love it, that live there. It's just fantastic. When you read about Japan, I mean, there's a demographic problem. There's an economic problem. There's a deflation problem. There's a stock market problem that reached a high in 1989. There's all these negative things that you don't necessarily, like I said, once if I lived there, maybe I'd see and feel it more, but you don't feel it on the ground as much there. So we know that's kind of true. But talk about Europe for me. I mean, I've seen some comments. Is Europe going this kind of path with a much older population with deflationary forces? I mean, is it talk about those two in the connective tissue, if there is any?
Yeah, so it's definitely worrying. And of course, Europe is a big place, and unlike Japan, it's not nearly homogenous. So there's a lot of good things to say about Europe. Germany really restructured. One of the reasons that Germany is doing so well is that 5 or 6 years ago, longer than that, actually more like 10 years ago, they really restructured their labor market, and they made their labor market much more flexible. So they moved in the right direction, and that has had big payoffs for them with the crisis. Greece obviously has not done that. Italy has not done that. Both of these countries, especially Italy, have a demographic problem as well. So, there's a big difference between Germany and, Great Britain, obviously. We'll see Great Britain seems to be still keeping it together, just barely. Scotland, wanted to go for less market-oriented policies. But they decided in the end to stay in the Union. So I think overall that's Great Britain is doing okay. Germany is doing fine. France, I think, will recover, but Italy is a real big question mark.
And I guess the connective aspect of having this, economic system with one currency, it kind of ties everyone together. So even if Germany in isolation was able to just kick royal tail, to some degree, they have to worry and deal with other countries that might not be doing so well.
The European Monetary Union was a big mistake. And the interesting thing here is that all of the economists virtually unanimously thought it was a big mistake going in. So you could take somebody like Milton Friedman, on the right, if you like, and he said this is going to be a disaster. And then prediction. Economists are often said, we can't predict anything. Well, we predicted the collapse of the European Monetary Union, the disaster of the European Monetary Union. Milton Friedman said it, but Paul Krugman said it too. Again, long before, it happened, they said this is not a good idea. And they outlined exactly how it was going to be a disaster. That different parts of the European Union required a different monetary system. And that was going to create massive tensions, problem with trying to reduce wages when you can't inflate away. And Friedman said it, Krugman said it, a lot of people, Tyler said it, a lot of people predicted in advance what a disaster this was going to be. On the other hand, other aspects of the union have been great. I'm a big fan of the movement of labor. The fact that you can, pick up from Spain and you can move to Great Britain or Germany or Italy. So that, I think, has been a very positive aspect of the European Union. And the trick is, how can we make sure that the disaster of the monetary union is not going to ruin the good parts of the free trade and the free movement of labor? That is one of the greatest achievements in the second half of the 20th century, coming from a place which had been at war, terrible, terrible wars, fighting one another for 50 decades, first half of the 20th century, coming out of that, creating a free trade union, creating a free movement of labor union, one of the great achievements of the second half of the 20th century. In the beginning of the 21st century, we have to make sure that that achievement is not going to be lost.
One thing I love about talking with you is, even though I've tried to push you a little and bring down some of the Debbie Downer type stuff, you're very optimistic. And, I like to think of myself as a pretty optimistic guy too. And, even I'm calling you tonight from Saigon. And, if I think about, if I was to sit down and play word association with most Americans and say, hey, Vietnam, and the next word out of their mouth is going to be war. That, they're not going to say skyscrapers and new subways and economic vitality. So, there really is hope for optimism all around the world. And I think travel, when you start to get out of your home base and you see what's going on, that's where the optimism really starts to happen. And that gets back to the beginning part of my conversation with you, is like really pressing my friends in Northern Virginia to think globally, with their kids even say, hey, listen, let's think globally. Let's don't just think about what we should do. Let's think about how big this world is, but we're all so close now. And it's just, it's fascinating stuff. I appreciate your optimism. It's awesome.
Yeah, I think I agree. And, I think Vietnam is a really interesting place right now. They're going to be an economic powerhouse. When you look at the quality of the Vietnam schooling and education compared to their GDP, they're actually off the charts. So I think that's a really positive sign for the future. And just looking around the world, China, India, Vietnam, as these countries get richer, they are producing many more scientists and engineers, people who contribute not just to China and to India, but to the entire world. We have some more great scientists, some more great entrepreneurs. If some Chinese innovator produces a cure for cancer, well, that's a cure for cancer we can all use. So I'm really excited, actually, about the vast expansion in education which is going on in the world and how that's going to benefit really everyone.
At the beginning of this conversation, you mentioned population totals. Let's say India's 1 billion, China's 1.4. So you got 2.5 billion people there. America's what, 350 million?
Yep.
Here's a factoid that most Americans might not think about. Take the population of Vietnam and the population of Indonesia, and you've got America's population.
Yep.
I mean, that's two countries that most Americans might not think about. Added together, 350 million people. That's a lot of people.
Yeah. And we often think about China and India as being poor places, which of course they are on average. Nevertheless, there's at least 300 million people of U.S. standard of living in China and India. So there are as many rich people in China and India as there are, in the United States.
Well, I tell you, when I'm in Beijing, I know why the German economy is doing so well, because there is a lot of German cars on the road in Beijing. So there's a lot of wealth. There's more wealth than you can necessarily even understand when you see it. It's big stuff. Hey, one last quick thing. So how much fun has it been to put the Marginal Revolution site up, to do the TED Talks? I mean, this probably changed your life to get out there and have this megaphone to reach people.
Yeah, it's been astounding. We were completely surprised, by how big it has become. Tyler Cowen and I, what we're most excited about now is Marginal Revolution University. This is our foray into online education. It speaks to many of the themes that we've been talking about. We're now offering, economics education to anybody in the world. We have students from China. We have students from Vietnam, from Peru, from all over. And these online technologies mean that, we can reach for the first time, people anywhere in the world can get a world-class education. You don't just have to go to Harvard, the tiny elite which goes to Harvard. For the first time ever, anybody, with a smartphone. It's 1.75 billion smartphones in the world today. In the next few years, basically everybody in the world is going to have a smartphone. And that means everybody in the world is going to have access to a world-class education. And we're, thrilled at Marshall Revolution University to play some part in that.
Well, I was just going to ask you as we wound down where we should send people. People can find you at your homepage on George Mason, but it sounds like Marginal Revolution University is a good place to go, and also the Marginal Revolution website.
Yep, marginalrevolution.com for the blog, where we write on economics every day, especially the amazing Tyler Cowen, and MR University, Marginal Revolution University, or MR University. That's for the online economics education.
If anybody out there thinks that this is just some Homer thing for my alma mater, George Mason University, I'm sorry. It actually keeps surprising me how many of you guys are there. I've had Walter Williams on, Vernon Smith, Tyler, Robin Hanson, you. Who else do I need to have on from my home university?
Oh yeah, there's plenty more to go. You got to get Brian Kaplan on. He's great. You got to go to the law school, get Todd Zwicky on. Yeah, there's plenty of depth to draw from there.
Well, listen, hey, appreciate it, Alex. Thank you for taking the time today, and hopefully we can talk again in the future.
Great talking with you, and thanks for promoting your alma mater.
Thanks. Take care. Awesome insights from Alex. Now on to the second part, my second interview with David Nott, the president of the Reason Foundation. The Reason Foundation, even though been around for decades, I would say for most people, the Reason Foundation, maybe they've seen a Nick Gillespie article or a video, maybe they've seen something somewhere, but maybe they don't really know the foundation. They don't really know what's behind it. And then I would love for you to define that, the purpose, the mission. We can discuss. I think there's some really interesting trustees and officers, especially in my world, that are part of Reason. But then I think also it might be useful for my audience, considering your position as president of Reason, to define from your perspective what it means to be a libertarian today, to be a promoter of liberty.
Well, we start with a fierce commitment to free minds and free markets. So it's liberty across the board. And we don't shy away from any form of freedom, and that makes us homeless with both Republicans and Democrats. But we think it's not enough to be right or to be on the side of these eternal classical liberal ideas that work, but that we actually have to sell them to people. And so we have to convert the principles into products that people want to consume. So that can be in the form of our journalism, the story-based journalism that shows victims and villains and explains the principles of liberty in a story form that people want to read. Or in the case of our public policy, to offer public policy solutions that actually make government work better, make citizens better off, make better use of knowledge and incentives, things that Hayek and others have talked about. So we're always looking to how do we do the transaction, how do we sell the libertarian ideas, and that's really been what has been behind Reason for our full 45 years.
Now, I think for some of the audience that still, if they hearken back and every presidential cycle, maybe you would hear that there was a libertarian candidate running. And even when I was a young man, it wasn't until I got into my 20s that I started to really have a perspective of like, hey, both parties are broken. These aren't solutions. And who's talking truth? And I think when most people go down the path of saying both parties are broken, that's when they finally start to, as you mentioned, Hayek or Mises, and you start to come to these libertarian ideals. How do you explain being a libertarian to people? When they hear about your position, they hear about your organization, what do you say to people about being a libertarian? What does it mean? A lot of people know what it means to be on the left or the right or a Democrat or a Republican. What's a libertarian to you?
I think most people understand that when you say you should be free to live your life to the best of your ability as long as you're not hurting anyone else, that simple compression is the animating idea of liberty. It's voluntarism in human transactions. And of course, we have intermediating institutions, we have contracts and property and estate and all these things within which we work. But the aspiration is that you live your life to the best of your ability as long as you're not hurting anybody else. And, that resonates with everybody. And that's really what libertarianism is all about. I mean, you mentioned the political theater. We, of course, are not in the political theater. We produce journalism and public policy research and analysis. So we're interested in the ideas and the stories and the principles. So we view some of our customers as the politicians, and they can come from either party, either of the big parties, or they could be from the Libertarian Party. Those are the people that we are trying to persuade or equip to advance free minds and free markets.
I should add here, as I mentioned earlier, the trustees, officers, some names that might jump out to my audience. And for example, Vernon Smith and Walter Williams have both appeared on my podcast show. And for my trading audience, Richard Dennis and William Dunn are quite famous, trend following type traders. I think what's really interesting about your trustees is there's a very, very famous Hollywood actor, Drew Carey. Would you mind giving some comment or how Drew Carey came to be involved with Reason?
Well, there was an evening with the editors back in the 90s before I was even at Reason, and they emailed the subscribers in Los Angeles and said, hey, come to an evening with the editors. And one of the people who RSVP'd was Drew Carey. And I guess the staff was like, is this the Drew Carey? So he came to the evening with the editors. They gave him a T-shirt, and then how I learned of that was I was watching the Drew Carey show on, and he walked into his house wearing a Reason T-shirt. And I'm like, oh my gosh, there's Drew Carey wearing a Reason T-shirt. So one thing led to another, and the relationship developed. And Drew had the vision for launching the Reason TV video, online video product that we now get 1 million views a month from. And during work with him on the Reason TV launch, I invited him to become a trustee, and he accepted, and he's been a really great idea guy and an avid backer of these principles.
I've got some examples that I want to talk about with you, strategic priorities and some of the various responses to certain public events that have taken place. But I'm curious from your big picture perspective, and I'm a little jaded. Okay, I grew up in the Washington D.C. area. I've seen way too much politics, and I'm not implying you've already established that that's not really where Reason's coming from a liberty perspective. But I've seen too much politics in the D.C. area, and I wonder if the system is permanently broken. And so my question to you is, where do you find the optimism to stay focused on trying one step at a time to get people swayed to the founding principles of our country, which were liberty? How do you stay focused and stay optimistic?
Well, you're a trend guy, Mike, and the trend, I think, over history is toward greater wealth, more individualism, and more freedom. And obviously there are countervailing forces and countervailing trends, but if you look at measures like life expectancy and wealth and view those as a byproduct of freer markets, we're going in the right direction. So I think we're on the right side, and that it can be very depressing, yes, and discouraging to look at how the politicians behave in their self-interest, how the state itself is interested in growing and expanding and taking on more power. It can be discouraging when Americans don't stand up and say no. Ultimately, that's what I believe in, and that's the project that I think we're advancing. And there's no guarantee that America's going to continue to get it right, but I'm gonna bet on that.
Well, I think you're kind of your good counter to me is kind of the glass half full, glass half empty. And I think if I was,
exactly.
I'm in the Asian side of the world right now. And I guess if, for example, if we were to look at China, and this often happens in rhetoric, people might look at the party and immediately focus on the politics.
Exactly.
But there's a lot of good economics and a lot of good freedoms going on in China, even though they're saddled with politics and state control that's surely not optimism. But there, I guess, as you would point out, but you like the idea that liberty is advancing in the face of all that.
Well, right. There's always a temptation to make things an extreme version of themselves. So, remember when Japan, the Japanese management was all the rage and everybody was supposed to do calisthenics in the morning because Japan was going to take over the world, and then Japan went flat. So this idea that even in our own system, we romanticize an America that is all about capitalism and freedom and free markets and business that is unencumbered by government, but government and business work hand in glove, and so it's no system is completely controlled from the center, nor is any system completely decentralized and free. They're all matters of degrees, and I think the systems that have a slight advantage over the other systems are the ones that end up being very successful. If I recall right, you played baseball. And, the difference between a 300 hitter and a 250 hitter is not that many hits, but it makes a profound difference in the outcome of the baseball games. Nobody's batting 1,000, nobody's batting 0, but these marginal differences really do matter in the outcomes for society.
Yeah, point well taken. I think sometimes it is our natural inclination to go black or white, all or nothing. And I think you make a point that if you can move that thermometer a little one way or the other, that you can really make a difference. Let me jump into something that we talked about in advance, and I'd like to hear your take on it. I mean, clearly the last 5 years have been, starting with the financial crisis, which really got rolling in the summer of 2007. I think it's when the markets first started going wild. And obviously we have a meltdown in the fall of October of 2008 and a bottoming out in the March of 2009. And then we've seen intervention on a scale that has not happened in the world yet with central banks. And I think a lot of this is, and of course, the idea of interest income is something that's going out the window. And I know before I even ask you that you're not a fan of that much state control or state activity, and I definitely was not a fan of the idea that we were going to bail out a couple investment banks, but not bail out others. So it was just crazy stuff. But what was Reason's response to the crisis and bailouts?
Let me back up just a little bit. The Reason is a magazine of ideas, and there are many magazines of ideas: The Nation, Mother Jones, American Spectator, New Republic, National Review. And I think of all of these magazines as like characters in the national conversation. And the question is whose moment is it to enter stage left and offer their speech and offer something of value to the conversation? And after September 11th, Reason really was in a tough spot because we were the vaguely anti-war, right-of-center magazine, and then we became the huge government expansion under Bush, right-of-center magazine, and there wasn't really a big audience for that because the Republicans didn't care that Bush was growing spending, and the Democrats had all gotten organized behind The Nation, which was the anti-war left-of-center magazine. So The Nation tripled in circulation during the Bush years, and similarly, the American Spectator quintupled during the Clinton years as the voice of the anti-Clinton right. And so when the financial crisis hit in the fall of 2008, we recognized that that the subject had changed from terror, which it had been from 2001 to 2008, to the money. And with our deep immersion in economics, we love to talk about the money. We love to talk about what works, what doesn't work. And it was a very liberating moment to say, this government waste, these government programs are terrible. They're distorting markets. They're ruining price signals. They're propping up bad businesses. And there was a real freedom in our rhetoric. And we, for the first time in a long time, didn't have to start out by saying whether something was fair or not. It was, well, it just doesn't work. So we came out very strong against government intervention in the fall of 2008, and it was a very lonely time. The Economist came out in favor of TARP. The Wall Street Journal was advocating for TARP. Even some of the supposed free market think tanks were advocating for government intervention in TARP. And then George Bush had the temerity to say, "I'm abdicating free market principles to save the free market system." But we went hard in the direction of let the markets clear, stay out of the private sector. And as a result, we had a very, very clear identity that was distinct from everybody else. And that notion of shrink government spending, which we had already been saying for years under the Bush administration, we were able to continue with that same message and that same framework of analysis through the GM bailouts, the ongoing the New Deal work programs. You still see these signs around putting America back to work with the American Recovery Act, and we still have record high unemployment rates. So for the last 6 years we've been in a very sweet spot, and we've seen the response in pretty much all of our metrics of web traffic, of number of financial supporters, that Reason represents an important point of view in this period of time that needs to be gotten out there, and it's very much in line with the impulse of the Tea Party as well.
Well, there's a certain common sense to it, because I think for the average person, if I was to take my mother and sit her down and say, okay, Mom, here's capitalism, and for example, there's 4 investment banks in America, and 2 of them are allowed to fail, and 2 of them are saved because they have friends in high places. And I think the average person, if they truly understand that, and then imagine that they were in the shoes of the loser, it's just not liberty. It's awful. That's the best way I can describe it.
Exactly. And common sense notions, don't spend more money than you make. These people get this sort of, I don't denigrate it by saying it's folk wisdom. It's wisdom.
Mm. Let me shift into something else that we kind of talked about that we wanted to address today. And that's the idea of pension reform. And I think for the average American, I don't know, you probably know the metrics more than I, but when it comes to the idea of pension reform, we're primarily talking about public pension reform, right? I mean, we're talking
Absolutely, public sector pensions. Yeah.
Right. And I think what's terribly frustrating about that, once again, I think it's an education issue where, you could have 2 people in the same neighborhood living side by side in maybe they're in a suburban area. They both live in a $250,000 suburban home next to each other. One person works for the private sector, one works for the public sector. And literally, there is no private sector pensions. So it's really coming down to, one neighbor is voting to make sure that he gets his guarantee, and having the other neighbor pay for that guarantee. I mean, isn't that essentially what's going on?
Yeah, basically. And I think that people understand that there's a problem. Not only, even if they don't understand that there is a $4 trillion unfunded liability across the U.S., state, federal, local, for public sector pensions, systematic underfunding of the pensions, combined with the last year's pay spiked with overtime. All of the things that I think are well documented and well understood by the public. And so not only is it a math problem, the guy looks at the guy next door who's getting the government pension and he says, that's not fair. So at an emotional level, people get it. Analytically, if they don't get it, the people who have to write the checks are starting to get it. Detroit, other bankrupt cities are getting it because sometimes nothing moves until it's forced. So you have an issue that it's the right side of math, it's the right side of emotion, and when you can get past the entrenched interests of the bureaucracy into the voters, it does very well. In San Diego, the Pension Reform Initiative won in every zip code with every demographic group. We went into Wisconsin and polled before the Scott Walker recall. The people who we ended up polling were Obama voters. They thought Scott Walker was mean, but when we polled them on the individual reforms that he was promoting, for instance, that public sector workers pay into their pensions the way the private sector people do, like 401k style pensions, 2/3 support for Scott Walker's reforms, even though they were not Scott Walker promoters. And even 30% of union households supported Scott Walker's reforms, which you might argue are against their very own interests, but I think they supported them because they recognize that the system as it's currently constructed is really broken and not fair. So a reason we've made this a strategic priority for the next few years because it's such a massive problem, and it's completely consistent with our methodology of working with motivated policymakers to affect change. So with a $4 trillion problem, we just need the policymakers to come forward who actually want to fix their city or their state. And if we can build some success cases, learn how to do it with them, and then provide demonstrations so that others can copy, that's very often how social change happens, and you can create policy cascades just like you see emotional cascades in markets.
My gut level about pension reform, and even though I know there's folks out there working to get things done, there's case examples. I sometimes think that there's, usually things don't happen in our system until there's some kind of a melt, some type of a big event. And often the results from those big events, as we saw in March of 2009, could be something that's quite amazing, like QE infinity. It'll be interesting to see how pension reform shakes out.
Well, certainly melts do drive change, and in some places will make the right kinds of changes when they face the melt, or in other places will try to then look for a bailout and not change their ways. So the melt doesn't guarantee the right response. But there is another category of change, which is leadership. There are people who understand math and right and wrong and have the courage and fortitude to lead change and affect change.
For some in the audience that might consider themselves to the right, and they might think they already know everything there is to know about reason because they've heard you mention a few Republican politicians, I want to talk about drug policy reform with you for a few minutes. Maybe if you can outline some of the big picture metrics about where things stand in terms of how much money has been spent, the numbers of people incarcerated, and talk about some of the mandatory minimums, and just talk about some of the logical insanity of the war on drugs. David, the floor is yours.
Well, a friend of mine was on the South Florida Drug Commission around 1971 or so, and she said she went to the first meeting, and she had done a lot of reading, and it was clear that if we had a problem with drugs, we needed to emphasize treatment for drug abuse, not prohibition. But that at the first meeting, it was clear to her that South Florida law enforcement viewed the drug war as a way to expand their business. And the entire judicial system is organized and has been reorganized around drug and quantity. So we've spent $1 trillion on the drug war. We have approximately quadrupled our prison population. At the state level, percentage of budgets gone from, say, 3% to, in some places, over 10% of state budgets for prisons, incarceration. So we're 5 to 10 times more people per capita in prison than any other Western developed country. Through asset forfeiture, police have gotten a unilateral taxing authority. The drug and quantity expedites prosecutions, so it's a way of putting people behind bars, and it's really the entire, and it's allowed the federal government to have an entry point into law enforcement and the funding of state and local law enforcement. So it's big business, number one, and it really has not been successful advancing any of its stated goals of reducing drug use and drug abuse.
Can I interject one thing here? But this is all, the entire drug war, if I'm not mistaken, isn't it still predicated on the simple idea of a leader standing at a podium and saying, well, if your child smokes a joint, he'll be doing coke next week and shooting up heroin the following week, and we can't have heroin abusers. It's something as insane as that's the logic of why we need this whole system. Even though it's clearly the reasons are what you just described, they use that silly little story is the backdrop, don't they?
There's an alignment of interests around the drug war. I first mentioned that the public choice interest and the state interest and the law enforcement interest. Parents don't want their kids on heroin. So there's a visceral desire to protect the children and a lack of knowledge about the relative risks of different drugs, and really a lack of understanding of how it's much riskier to have illegal narcotics that are with a lack of information and in a black market than it is to have regulated, controlled, taxed, openly discussed types of things. I mean, the Dutch introduced their system of tolerance with marijuana, and they said their objective was to make narcotics boring. And so drug use is actually lower among Dutch youth than, here in the United States. So, and also you have a lot of paradoxical things that have resulted. I mean, drugs are illegal, but more American youth have tried marijuana than have tried tobacco, which is controlled. So there are perverse outcomes. So you have the general impulse of parents, and then I think there's also a very religious impulse in this country about that there's an opposition to intoxication generally. You can see this through the temperance movement, and it's the unproductivity of intoxication. So you put those three forces together, and that's been a very, very strong cultural juggernaut in favor of prohibition. But as people have seen their kids going to jail for no good reason, as people have seen the failures of the drug war, and as the economy has tightened up, it's been interesting post-financial crisis, since there's not as much money flowing around through the system, people are looking a little more carefully at what we're spending our money on and what we're getting for it. And so there's been a shift in public opinion away from support for the drug war, and now for the first time we're seeing Americans are opposed to prohibition writ large. We're also seeing 20-some states have implemented medical marijuana laws, and that consistently polls at 60 to 70%. It is about compassion and therapy. And then we have the Colorado and Washington state that have legalized marijuana. And so you can see the change in the culture, and this connects back to young people as well, who recognize the inconsistency of the rhetoric on drug policy with the reality of drugs. And I would add something further, that one of the dirty secret of the drug war is that 80+ % of the drug users in this country are marijuana users. If you take away marijuana from the drug war, you don't have enough drug users, in some sense, to justify the entire regime that has been built around prohibition. And so there's this need to keep marijuana, which is arguably less invasive. It's certainly less addictive than tobacco, and the harms are arguably less than some of the other drugs. So there's an interesting wedge point there about what is going to happen with marijuana policy, because there aren't people lining up to become heroin addicts. It's a pretty unpleasant lifestyle.
And I should add here that I don't do anything. I don't want to stop people that aren't harming me. If somebody wants to smoke a joint, if they want to take a bong hit, if they want to use medical marijuana, if they want to do cocaine, if it's in the privacy of their personal being and they're not harming anyone, I don't want to have any of my energy, money, effort, or anybody in the public sphere that I have to vote for or support try and stop them. And that gets back to your opening comment about liberty.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, one last thing I want you to expand on, which I think is kind of probably fun for you, which is seeing younger people come to the idea of liberty. Perhaps younger people that have witnessed decades of their parents and their grandparents debating left and right issues. And then maybe some of the millennials are waking up and saying, people are all crazy. What is going on here? Let's be rational. Let's be reasonable. Let's talk about what really matters. Talk about reason in reaching young people.
Well, we just went into the field and did a poll of millennials, and we did an oversample with an internet poll to make sure that we got statistically significant results. And what we found is that, similar to what other polls have found, is that this generation is socially more liberal than previous generations. But there's also a very strong cohort of people who in this generation who support free markets. But if you're in favor of free markets and you're socially liberal, you may not have very many political heroes that you can look to. But it actually speaks to the success of Ron Paul, who got an enormous youth vote in the last election because he had a consistent set of principles that resonated with young people. And so, Ron Paul provides the decoder ring that this generation, there's a very fallow ground for the ideas of free minds and free markets.
I'll give you some fun feedback in my world. So I started this podcast in early 2012 and a couple million listens so far. But what's really fun is having some of my guests come on that have a libertarian perspective. And I'm thinking of two in particular that you know well, Vernon Smith and Walter Williams. It's so fun to do podcasts with guys like that. And, of course, they're older, but it's not old in age. It's wise, because those are two of the youngest guys you can talk to. And it's so fun for me to have them on and realize that for a lot of people, they don't know them. They don't know those names. They don't necessarily know those voices. But the feedback I'll get is so cool. People are just like, God, that guy Walter Williams is great. Who is he? Who's this guy Vernon Smith? And it's just so nice to be able to sit back and have these conversations and then get their messages out. It just excites me. I love doing it.
Well, a guy like Vernon follows the data, and he follows the experiments, and he's really an incredibly careful scientist of economics. And you line him up against so many of the economists for hire, because the government needs to justify its programs and what it does, and it actually ends up corrupting what the economists say. I mean, I think it was Christina Hoff Sommers when she was appointed to the Council of Economic Advisors. She was saying things rhetorically from her perch in government that were contradictory to her academic research, and it makes it hard to sort through the noise of economic rationalization of QE 27, and that's where somebody like Vernon just brings such great clarity, because he's really outside of the political process and zeroed in on the data.
I know none of us can live forever, but I have to tell you, some of these wise guys that have seen it all. And you talk to Vernon, and Vernon's talking about the 1930s like it's yesterday, but talking like he's a teenager. And it's just, you just love it. It's just fantastic. Hey, David, listen, I can't keep you. Where is the best place for people to start? So they want to jump into the Reason world. They want to maybe check out a subscription, watch the videos. Where should we send them to?
All of our magazine content is at reason.com. And our policy work is all at reason.org. And if you just want to watch videos, you can go to reason.tv. So reason.com, reason.org, reason.tv.
Great. Hey, I appreciate it. Hopefully I will see you in LA sometime soon. Hey, by the way, you mentioned Japanese and the calisthenics. I have a buddy who's high up with Honda, and I think they're in Torrance. And I still think they do calisthenics out there in front of the Honda facility. I'm not sure.
Well, I support calisthenics.
What? I love calisthenics too, but I'm not doing them in an organized fashion in front of corporate headquarters. So, hey, listen, David, I appreciate you taking the time today, and hopefully we can talk again in the future.
My pleasure, Mike. Thank you.
Take care. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.